see this. All right, well, my name's Cody Maxwell. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the Fannin County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources. And each fall, we try to bring to you a winter pasture webinar. The reason this year we kind of delayed on it a little bit is, we hadn't had any soil moisture to work with. And so a lot of times, many producers really don't start thinking about winter pastures until there's some soil moisture to work with. Well, that happened last week here in the North Texas, Southern Oklahoma area. So I thought it was a pretty timely topic to bring this to you now, as we may think of this and hopefully get some rain chances as we move on through the latter part of October on into November. There's going to be a few things that we'll discuss today. We're going to talk about cool season legumes, grasses, fertilizer consideration, and then probably not going to spend a whole lot of time on pests of the cool season grasses, but if we get to it, there's only one that we really have to worry about, and it's the armyworm. But we have time at the end, we'll discuss that a little bit, but I really just want to spend a lot of time talking about the options that you have when it comes to planting your cool season pastures. So we'll start with legumes, and again, legumes, cool season grasses in no particular order here. But we'll start with the legumes. Some advantages that you have with them is the high nutritive value that comes along with them. We'll talk about why here in just a little bit, but they're going to tend to carry a higher crude protein value, which if you're not familiar with crude protein value in our feeds or in our hays, what that is the amount of nitrogen times 6.25. That's how we get that crude value of the protein in that. So it's crude value of the protein, which would be the nitrogen times 6.25. When used properly, it can be an alternative source to nitrogen fertilizer. As we know, and we're going to talk about it here a little later on, fertilizer prices have not been our friend over 2021. They've been extremely high, in some cases double what they were in 2020. And we'll talk about those numbers here after a while. But if these legumes are used properly, then they can be an alternative source to nitrogen fertilization. And then palatability. Palatability, obviously, that's going to be how well the animals like it. Disadvantages when it comes to legumes is they're more soil specific. We'll get into that here in a little bit. The types of soils, the pHs of the soils that they prefer. Many times it comes up that, hey, I want to plant legumes and I want them to reseed themselves. We'll show you here in a little bit which ones are listed as having a high reseeding value or a low reseeding value. But they are annuals, and so you must remember that. So therefore, with an annual, we're going to have to plant year after year. Now we can try to allow them to go to seed, but again, they have to have that high reseeding value to be able to reseed themselves. You're going to find that some of them have some bloat potential with them. There's some alternatives that we can do to help minimize that by using some bloat block with our livestock. It looks just like a mineral block. But it's a bloat block that you can put on the ground or in a trough, and those animals will go by. It's extremely palatable, and they'll lick that, and it will minimize the bloat potential within those legumes. Again, I'll mention too, this is very informal, so as we go along, if you have any specific questions, feel free to type that in the chat box, unmute your mic, and we can try to get those answered as we go along, or we'll have time at the end to be able to answer those. The types of legumes here in North Texas and Southern Oklahoma that we look at, that we refer to, are going to include those that are on your screen right there. Airleaf clover, white clover, rose clover, crimson clover, ball clover, vetch, turnips, radishes, and Persian clover is another one. So we said we'd get in and we would talk about the characteristics of all of these. And there's a lot going on this chart, and I'm going to walk you through it. And it'll take us a little bit to get through it, but I want to spend just a little bit of time on this so we can see you know, what we're working with on these legumes. Are they going to work for you? Are they not? If you're looking to try to let them go to seed, are they going to work to reseed themselves as far as blow potential? Do we have to worry about it a whole lot, or do we not? But most importantly, you look at the species there on the left-hand side of the screen, and we see the species of the clover. Then we move over to the preferred soil characteristics in the second, third, and fourth columns as you go down. You can see that on these clovers, on the average, they like a slightly acidic to a slightly alkaline type soil. And the way we know that is that range that we're looking at right there. As you see there in the airleaf clover on the pH, it likes a 6 to a 7. So what that tells me is if I'm in a heavy clay soil and what we call the blackland clay or the blackland soil. So area wise, you know, if you're in Leonard, Trenton, you know, we're probably dealing with a pH that's somewhere in the neighborhood of the 8 range. So airleaf clover is not going to be adaptable to that soil. So therefore that tells us, even though we plant it, that does not mean it's going to work, because we've got to have a soil that's going to work and be adaptable for this seed to be able to germinate and then emerge out of the soil there. You see the texture of the soil on airleaf, it likes a sandy loam. Moving down to ball clover, now if you are in those heavy black clays that we just talked about, ball clovers listed there, Berseem clover, Persian clover as you go down the list, red clover, rose clover, subterranean clover. So those are going to be the ones that have that more adaptable range, we'll say, that moves all the way from a 6 all the way to an 8. In some cases, is a ball clover up to an 8.5. And you can see the type of texture that it likes is a loam or a clay. I'm going to go to the chat box. Looks like we have a question here. Can legumes also be harvested for food, or do we just leave them to pull nitrogen, i.e. the turnip? Is it too late to plant radish? We'll get to all that here in just a little bit on the planting dates. But this is going to mainly just be for our livestock to consume that's out there. So we're looking at a food source on the ground for livestock as we talk about this. Moving over to the drainage. And so what that tells us, that kind of correlates also with the texture of the soil. Those loams or the clays, those soils that have higher or larger particles that are more porous, those soils obviously are going to be porous draining soils. Our sandy type soils, as you see there on the airleaf clover, the sandy loam, those types of soils, the sandy loam type soils, are going to be listed as well drained type soils. Moving on to the next columns, we move into the plant characteristics. And the first one that you see there is the maturity. Then we go to bloat potential, reseeding potential, cold tolerances in the plant characteristics there. Later on in the program, we're going to talk about mixing species together. So in this case, if you were going to go in with a mixed species of clovers, what we're going to want to do is put an early, a medium, and a late together, or an early and a late together. Reason because is if we're looking for grazing or if our utilization is going to be grazing, we just don't want a specific short time frame to be able to graze those animals. Therefore, if we can combine early and late maturing, we'll have early grazing and we'll have late grazing as well. Time frame of utilization that you could say there on these clovers, the early is going to be the crimson. That's going to be the one that's used most commonly in our area as an early maturing variety. Usually about March time frame is when we're going to start being able to utilize our crimson clover. Moving into our late maturing, the airleaf there is a good example, one that's used very much in this area, and also ball clover. Time of utilization is probably going to be later on in April, past April 15th here for our area, on into May prior to it flowering and then making seed. Moving into the bloat potential there, again, it's a concern for some. but some may not be as concerned on the bloat potential on these. Again, if you are putting these out, if you put your bloat block out, should minimize that bloat potential. But airleaf clover there, for an example, low bloat potential on it. You move down to the Persian clover, and that's high bloat potential. Now, you may not have seen or heard of clover before, but when I point out what it looks like to you, you're going to be like, I've had Persian clover and I didn't even know it. This last year was an exception for us. Late winter and spring of 2021, of course, I don't want to have to remind us, but you think back to the winter storm that we had. Forget about this year. Let's go back about the last 4 years. A lot of spring rains, warming up quite a bit in the spring as well. We had a lot of volunteer clover that was coming up, and I'd get phone calls at the office of people that would say, hey, I've got a clover that's coming up. It's got a small purple flower on it. Leaf kind of looks like airleaf clover a little bit, just a smaller leaf. And they'd ask, what is it? Well, that's your Persian clover that you're dealing with right there. And so in springs where we have a lot more moisture during the spring, a lot more precipitation, we have seen Persian clover be one of those that has come up volunteer in areas. The one thing about it, though, is it's high bloat potential. So if you have that, again, just put you out a bloat block and it should be okay. You see your reseeding potential there on the next column. And then cold tolerance. This is something for our area that we probably need to pay attention to. If it's listed as good or fair, you're good to go with it. And most of them are here on this list, except for Berseem clover. We don't see a whole lot of that that's planted here in our area. The big ones are going to be airleaf, ball, crimson clover, particularly that's listed on this list. Then you get over to the seeding rate there on the far right-hand side, and you can see much variation as we go down through there. If we are going to mix species, we cut those rates, and we do 2/3 of that rate if we're going to be mixing species. And I'll have a chart for you at the end of the presentation when we get to that. Moving on, I know a lot going on that slide and a lot to cover, but we'll move on here to some other things that come up as far as our legumes. And you see Austrian winter pea there at the top, and then moving down to our vetch there at the bottom of the screen. Austrian winter pea, we're going to plant that and vetch quite a bit heavier. Again, when we move into the mixed species, cut it to 2/3 of the rate of what you see there. Austrian winter pea, 35 to 40 pounds per acre. Moving over to the soil type that it likes. These two right here is when we start moving into those more acidic soils. So if you're listening to us and you're on the north side of the county, if you're looking at planting legumes, this is where you perk up a little bit. We're moving into those that are more adaptable in our sandy loam type soils. You see the pH ranges there on the Austrian winter pea from a 5.8 to a 7. And then vetch is highly adaptable for our area, stretching all the way from the north to the south side of the county, going from those sandy soils all the way down to the heavy clays, the alkaline type soils from a 5 all the way to an 8.0. If we get below a 5 on our pH, that's where we probably need to have a conversation about going in there and adjusting that, whatever the case may be and whatever we're trying to grow, because we're getting into some extreme acidic situations with that. Moving over to your reseeding column there, Austrian winter pea is low, vetch is listed as medium. Cold tolerant, they're both fine for our area, and they have a low bloat potential. And you can see the flowering date there in terms of the maturity and utilization of these. And utilization is going to be a little later on in the spring, moving on into the April months for vetch, and then April and May for the winter pea. Any questions so far? If not, moving into the next thing. This is very important whenever we get into talking about legumes. We have to inoculate that seed. And so what that is it's a ground peat moss that is a carrier of the Rhizobium bacteria. When you purchase a legume seed, it's probably important to ask this question from whoever you're purchasing it from, to see if it's pre-inoculated. If you can get it pre-inoculated, that's probably the best way to do it. If not, you can purchase the inoculant and mix it yourself. You can see there in the photo, this person has mixed it, It kind of looks like gunpowder. Basically, it's a kind of a sooty kind of ash type substance. Is kind of what it looks like. And you get it on your hands, and it looks like ash on your hands there, or gunpowder. So very important in terms of legumes. We want to make sure that we've got that pre-inoculate on there, so we can ensure the carry of the rhizobium bacteria. All right, so now we move into planting these. And this is where we get into a lot of situation discussion. And we could discuss for days each individual person's situation to find out what might work best for you. All right, so probably the most recommended is going to be planting with a no-till drill when it comes to these clovers. The reason because is we need them just a tad bit deeper than simply just a broadcast. And so we're able to do that with the no-till drill. Some of these clovers, the seeding depth, I don't know if we had it back here on this. I don't see it on there, but we'll have it a little later on in the presentation. But some of them have to be simply deeper than just a simple broadcast out there, as you see in this next picture. If you are going to plant these clovers with a broadcast, what's going to need to be done is you need to do a light disc on the pasture. Then if you can, come and pull a drag over it of some type, and we can get as creative as we want to when we talk about dragging these pastures. There's all different ways that you can do it, all different types of things that you can use to drag these pastures or roll them. But if we are going to broadcast, that's what we need to do. If we're planting in to an existing pasture, an existing warm season perennial pasture, such as native grass or Bermuda grass, when we plant with that no-till drill, or when we broadcast for that matter as well, it's very important that we either mow it down short or we stock it heavy and graze it down heavy. Reason being is if and we hadn't had to worry about a whole lot of fall rains to have too much excess forage out there, so it's not as a concern this year as it was last year. But when these start to germinate and emerge, we need as much sunlight available as possible to this plant as we can. Obviously, we need the soil moisture as well, but also sunlight is extremely important when it comes to the growth of these. If we have a lot of excess forage out there, then that's going to prevent that plant from being able to come and grow as we would so desire for it to. Here's where we get into the planting depth. We kind of talked about the preparing this into an established warm season pasture. So we're looking at about 1/4 of an inch deep in the soil on the clovers. And so again, we need a good seed to soil contact. And that's why we typically don't really like to just broadcast onto an existing pasture with these clovers. Not saying that it won't work. Our success rate just isn't going to be as good as we would like it to be. Therefore, going in and lightly disking that tends to work much better, or using that no-till drill definitely works a lot better. 1/4 of an inch deep, so 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch deep should work well. If we are using that winter pea, we need 1/2 an inch to an inch. We've got a wide window of planting right there. And you see that it did start back in mid-September. If you were going in the ground, if you were using a no-till drill, it's kind of, with all humor in this, but if we were planting back in mid-September, you'd probably say good luck. The ground was extremely hard, remained extremely hard all the way up until that rain that we got last week. And still, as many of you will say, it's soaked it up really quick. And so we still don't have a whole lot of soil moisture that we're working with, but much better than what it was 2 weeks ago. And so we really start getting it on our mind whenever we have some soil moisture to work with. Thankfully, our night temperatures earlier on this week cooled off quite a bit, but we've warmed up in the days, warmed up in the nighttime. It's really humid out there as well, so that tends to help with things too when it comes to talking about planting these cool season pastures. But again, nonetheless, it works so much better when we've got some soil moisture to work with, because when it comes to the wear and tear on the equipment, it sure does work a whole lot better. So last year, we were able, y'all remember first frost last year, and I didn't write this down, but I think it was December 9th or 10th last year in 2020. We had a planting window. I remember working and talking with people last year in 2020 because it remained so warm moving on through the latter part of that fall. There was people that were still planting up till December 31st last year in 2020. I'm not going to say that that's recommended by no means at all, because the earlier we plant, the earlier we get to utilize it. But when conditions are proper for us to be able to do so, we can extend that date past November if we have, past middle of November if we have to. So this year, with where we're working at right now, you know, pending an Arctic blast that comes down prior to December 1st, I would say that we need to change that date right there to either the end of November or the 1st of December. Again, earlier we plant, the earlier we get to utilize. However, when those fall temperatures, fall soil moisture is right for us to plant, we can still continue to do so. Nitrogen fixation, and I'm getting to cool season grasses. We'll be there just momentarily. So if legumes aren't your thing, we're about to get to the cool season grasses here in just a little bit. I want to talk just a minute about the nitrogen fixation. This can only be done by the legumes. And so what happens, and if you can see in this picture, you see the root system on that plant right there. You see these little white nodules as we have that that larger root that's coming down right in the middle of the screen right there. You see the nodules that are working down that finger-like root right there. That's going to be where this plant is fixing nitrogen within itself. If you were to pull this plant up and pushed on those nodules, pink stuff is going to come out of it. So we get about 20% of the utilization of that nitrogen beneath the soil surface that works its way up through that plant. Just because we plant legumes out there doesn't mean we're going to get the full nitrogen fix that we're looking for that soil. The other 80% of it, as you see right there, comes from that animal consuming the soil, the manure that's deposited onto that soil, going back down into the ground. The extra 80% comes from that. So, you know, when we get into the springtime pastures, and we call them cool season pastures, a lot of cases we should probably refer to them more as spring pastures, because that's when majority of our utilization comes from them. But we're planting during the cool season months, or in the case of most falls now, cool season's turned into hot. But when these animals get out there and they graze this legume, the clover, vetch, what have you, you know, our manure patties can get pretty loose during that time of the year. And so if we have a side-by-side or tractor or truck, and if we can take us a 16-foot cattle panel, and as those animals are concentrated on that area, we've got those manure piles concentrated on that area. If we can go and drag those across that pasture, that really bumps up I don't want to say the fixation of the nitrogen, because it's not a fixation, but our utilization of that nitrogen that has been made possible because of that plant. So just because we plant the legumes doesn't mean we're going to get the full gamut of its ability to provide us with the nitrogen. It's important for us to be able to be grazing livestock out there. All right, now we're moving into the cool season grasses. Moving right along, the 5 that we're going to talk about in our area right here, the 5 that are the most popular, it's going to be ryegrass, wheat, oats, rye, and this is a cereal grain, so it's cereal rye, and triticale. We'll talk about every single one of these and how to utilize them as well. So we'll start with ryegrass. We break them up into tetraploid versus diploid variety. And so basically how it works, and all of these go through extensive research, extensive plant breeding to bring us up to the point to where we're at right now with what we have available to us. So over the last couple of decades, they've been developing new cultivars, and as they develop them, the new strains are that we find that are work really well are the tetraploids. Well, basically the difference when we break it down to a genetic code or DNA on there, there's 4 sets of the same chromosomes in the tetraploid, which gives you 28, while the diploids have 2 sets, and so that means 14. So what does all that mean whenever we get into the chromosomal makeup is that ryegrass, the tetraploid varieties, are going to have larger leaves. They got more biomass than the diploid. In terms of cold tolerance, we'll talk about that on every one of these. Ryegrass is going to be our least cold tolerant of cool season grasses. However, when we move into springtime temperatures, we all know what ryegrass will do because mostly everybody deals with volunteer ryegrass that comes up. And it moves on pretty aggressive once we hit about March 15th. And especially when we get into about April 15th, it's probably at its peak in most aggressive state at that point in time. Time of utilization, as you can see down there at the bottom, is February to May. There was no utilization of ryegrass this February. There's no utilization of nothing except ice. It's about what we had available to us during the month of February. Extremely tough time. All of us remember having to work during that time and whatever. It was mainly feeding livestock during that time, but an extremely tough time. So a year like that gave us no utilization during that time. However, when we came out of that, moving on into March, you remember some March rains that we got, and then it kind of shut off and started turning warm on us. And then things really started to move on once we got into April. And then, of course, you remember when we dealt with May, it was so much rain we didn't know what to do with our wettest May that we've had on average. So ryegrass, about March 10th is what I always tell people. March 10th is when we can expect ryegrass to start moving into a direction where we can really utilize it. Anytime before that, yeah, if you plant it right now, you're probably going to have 2 to 3 inches of ryegrass out there by Christmas time, but it's going to stall out and not do anything until we get into the latter part of February, moving on into March. And then April and May is when we really get to utilize it. Wheat. Wheat is going to be one of our more cold tolerant type cool season grasses that we have. It works well in our area. As you drive around, I've seen a lot of wheat pastures that was planted early, predominantly for our stocker operators in the county. That's where we see wheat utilized a little bit more so than our cow-calf type operations. And so we had some producers that went ahead and kind of bit the bullet, you could say, went ahead and put in the wheat during August and September. Of course, you run a little risk with the fall armyworm there. You also run the risk of getting it germinated with the soil moisture as well. And of course, there wasn't any. But now as you drive around, you're starting to see a little wheat that's emerged and up 3 to 4 inches high in some early planted areas. Again, it works well for our area, southern Oklahoma. The thing about these cool season grasses, and not just wheat right here, but all of them, as we go through all 5 of them, they can handle a heavy stocking rate. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here after a while. But you're looking for the case of our cow-calf producers here. If we manage these cool season grasses properly, you're talking about a cow to every acre. And that's if you get the yield potential that you expect. That's if you put in the management strategies to make it reach its full yield potential. So they can endure a heavy stocking rate. The thing about wheat is we get some early grazing opportunities because it works well in warm areas, and it also works well in cold areas as well. So months of utilization are going to be December through April. You remember back to when we talked about the legumes, we talked about some mixed species in there. Same thing goes for our cool season grasses. Same thing goes with intermixing the legumes and the grasses together. So what we can do is when we mix these early maturing varieties or species, late season maturing varieties or species, then we can have staggered grazing throughout. So in the case of, we'll just use the 2 that we've talked about, for example. If wheat's months of utilization are December to April, But ryegrasses are February to May. We mix those two together, then we can have early grazing and we can have late grazing as well. Potential of having grazing from December, January, all the way into May. And so that's just a little more tidbit on the mixing the species. Our next one that we'll move into is going to be oats. Again, another one that's widely used in our area, North Texas, Southern Oklahoma. It's extremely cold tolerant for our area. Again, one that can be used from December to April. And some, when they look at mixing the different grasses together, a common or popular mix is going to be wheat, oats, and ryegrass. So you get a little broader leaf in there with the oats. That later utilization, you go in there with the tetraploids on the ryegrass, you get that broader leaf, the more biomass with the forage that you get as well. And so we can have some extremely good grazing. Again, we've got to have our weather conditions on our side, but definitely something to consider. Oats works very well for our area as well. All right, Rye and Triticale. These are ones that you may not see used as much, but have an extreme amount of value when it comes to cool season grazing. So cereal rye is actually probably, if you break it down and wanted to rank all 5 of these of the cold tolerant varieties and which one is the most cold tolerant, cereal rye is probably going to be the one. Not to be confused with ryegrass, because that does come up sometimes. So there is the difference between the two, but cereal rye is probably going to be that most cold tolerant for our area. Again, graze is very much like that of wheat and oats. Then you move down and you look at the bottom of the screen there and you find triticale. We've had producers use triticale here in our area. We've got some pretty good research out of Vernon that we can turn to give us some information about this. But what triticale is it's a hybrid. It's a cross between wheat and cereal rye. Extremely cold tolerant. As I said, it's starting to be used in our area. The thing that you get in with these two is the cost on them. They're going to be a little bit higher than what you would find with the wheat and the oats, which probably attributes to why we don't see it used as much. And then you see there in that trial that I referred to in Vernon, it yielded about 1/2 ton more dry matter per acre than wheat. And so again, when in terms of forage biomass, the availability of forage that we have out there, if we're looking to stock a little bit heavier and it fits the budget, maybe something to give some consideration to, because we have seen it work well in our area. The one thing that I'll mention about the wheat, oats, the cereal rye, and the triticale, this won't be the case for the ryegrass, but if we're going to use one of those 4, the earlier we can get those in, the better, because you saw the utilization is December. And again, I know we hadn't had any soil moisture to work with, so you're probably sitting there thinking, Cody, you're contradicting yourself when you talk about this stuff. But again, the earlier we can get these in, the better, because if we get them up, if we can get some nitrogen fertilizer on them to really move them along to that potential that they have, we can move into a state of grazing those possibly by December, sure by Christmas time, 1st of January. Moving to our next slide here, moving into talking about the planting methods and how do we plant these. We've got 3 different options when we plant cool season grasses. We can plant into a prepared seed bed, and this is probably going to be more seen when we look at our wheat and our oats and our cereal rye and our triticale. Not as much with the ryegrass because of the planting depth. When we get into some of these planting depths, we're going to be a little bit deeper than what you would find on the clovers that we were in. So one is planting into a prepared seed bed. The next one is doing a light disc method. And we talked about that during the clover, but that's just running a disc over your existing pasture that you have there, and then coming and doing a broadcast seed in that area. Then we have what we call overseeding or sod seeding into undisturbed soil. And so what we can do there, overseeding, if we go into an undisturbed soil or this would just be going into an existing pasture, not doing anything to prepare a seed bed whatsoever. The only one that we would recommend doing a broadcast with on this would be ryegrass. If you go out there and broadcast wheat or oats into an existing pasture there that has not been prepared at all, it's probably not going to work. We've got to have those in the soil. The sod seeding, or we should probably have no-till drill method right there. You saw it earlier in the clover, but that's where we're going to just no-till that right into that existing pasture that we have right there. So one advantage to that is if we've got some extra grazing that's out there, if we no-till that in, we can continue to utilize that warm season perennial pasture on into when it goes dormant and up until the point until we get emergence from that cool season grass. Going into a prepared seed bed, what we like to do is destroy existing vegetation. And so again, this is when we're going in and doing that hard disc on that soil. We're really preparing this, getting it ready for those cool season grasses. But what we like to do prior to, if we can, and this is one thing to err on the side of caution with, or don't do it all, I should say, is if you have a warm season perennial pasture out there right now that's still active, meaning our Bermuda grass or our native grasses. Because what that destroy existing vegetation means is we're going out there and we're using glyphosate to eradicate what we have out there. And the reason that we're doing that in this case of going into a prepared seed bed, remember that's what we're talking about right now, is that way we can destroy all existing competition and then be able to come in and plant something and have full opportunity for it to come up and have success. What we'll do is we'll disc and then roll for packing to provide a firm surface for planting and moisture retention with that. The light disc method, how we do that, and it's used predominantly for those Bermuda grass pastures. When we're working with those native grasses, we're dealing with the clump grass there. So a light disc is much harder to do, if nearly impossible, in those types of pastures. What we'll do, we talked about it earlier on in the clover. We try to graze those pastures down pretty heavy if we can, to try to eliminate, or not eliminate, but get the competition out of the way, or go in there, make a hay harvest on it, or mow those pastures down to less than 4 inches. Then we do a light disc. We turn that soil an inch or 2 inches deep, and then we'll come in there and we can plant with the drill or we can broadcast it. So that's how we're going to do the light disc method. Then we talk about the overseeding or the sod seeding, and I kind of talked about that a little more in depth on that previous slide, so we won't spend much time on it right now. But again, when we're doing this, we like to graze down those pastures pretty heavy so we don't have competition to deal with. Or, probably another thing we need to bring up right now is if you got a Dallas grass pasture out there. And we all deal with Dallas grass in some sort of a case or another, but we've got the tall stems that are out there, or if you're in areas where you might have Bahia grass, you're probably dealing with tall stems right now as well. We can go through there and mow those down to try to reduce the height on that grass. That's going to significantly help us out whenever we come in there and try to no-till or overseed with a broadcast with these cool season grasses. We'll talk about this here in a little bit when we get into the broadcast and the ryegrass. If you broadcast cool season grasses, and again, if we're going to do it with wheat, oats, cereal rye, or triticale, we need to do that light disc method. If we're going to broadcast those, if we simply go out there and broadcast on that existing pasture and don't get it into the ground to have that good seed to soil contact, they're not going to work. But if we do broadcast, we need to increase those seeding rates by 25 to 30%. All right, what you've all been waiting for probably. fertilizer considerations. You probably are thinking, well, we probably just take this slide out because they're too high. We're probably not even giving consideration to it. You know, I want you to think about it still, because I'm going to show you some real life numbers here in a little bit that's going to bring some light onto all of this. You know, I've heard prices on fertilizer. We'll talk urea specifically. I've heard them anywhere from about $600 all the way up to over $800 a ton on the urea. How does that compare to last year? If you haven't ever fertilized before, those prices were in the upper 300 range last year in 2020, back to springtime of 2020, and even in the fall of 2020, we were in the upper 300. So we have doubled in our fertilizer price. Phosphate, potassium, they're up there in that range as well. As compared to last year, you know, phosphate was right there around 400 to 425 a ton last year in 2020. Again, it's doubled this year in price, up around $800 a ton on that as well. And so whenever we look at blending these fertilizer blends, you know, when we look at a price per ton, we're probably going to be in somewhere in that neighborhood. If we're blending nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, somewhere in that neighborhood of $700 to $800 a ton, roughly, is what we'd be looking at. In some cases, we might be getting in that $800 range in some cases. So now that we've got the prices out of the way, let's talk about what we've got to do in terms of fertilizer to get the yield potential that we're looking at. If we go out there and just sling these grasses out, or if we go out there and just put them into the soil, we're not going to get the yield potential that they have available to us. We're not going to be able to stock that cow to the acre that I talked about a little earlier on when we were talking about wheat and ryegrass. We need 120 to 150 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre to make these things work. So what that looks like whenever we're dividing it up is we need at least 2 to possibly 3 split applications of somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen to make these things reach their full yield potential. If we don't, I mean, it's just the fact of the matter, they're not going to work to our desire. They'll work for sure, but we plan them to minimize our hay that we have to feed, and that's going to be probably another topic that may come up if we have time here in a little bit. Some of you may have questions on that. But when we look at these split applications, if we're able to do, and we're kind of coming down in the neighborhood, we really don't like to do a nitrogen application after Thanksgiving. So we've got a month left. So if we put that grass in the ground today and it comes up, we might get to do a nitrogen application on it, if possible, before Thanksgiving. If not, we may be looking at moving into springtime or winter if the weather allows us to. So if we miss this first application, we may be looking at moving into, again, if the budget allows us to, do 2 split applications of 60 pounds of nitrogen. Apply phosphorus, potassium at or prior to planting according to the soil test recommendations. These are the 2, especially with the cost of them. And again, we've got to take that pencil to the paper and figure out if they're going to work. If it works, by all means, if the soil test tells us to put down phosphorus and potassium, then we've got to, we need to. They bring so much value to our plant growth and development that we can't sell ourselves short on it. I realize that we're all working on a budget too, and when calf prices haven't got quite where we'd like them to be, sometimes we have to cut things where we see fit. And so if you haven't soil tested, you know, we may be looking at trying to get that grass in the ground and trying to pull a soil test at the same time. That way, in a couple of weeks, we can have that back and know what we need to do. Getting into our planting rate, seeding rate on our ryegrass, 25 to 30 pounds per the acre. If we're going in the ground, 25 pounds to the acre. If we're broadcasting, we need to be planting at that 30 pounds per acre or slightly above that. Our planting depth ranges from 0 to 1/2 inch. And so this is the one, you've been hearing me say it all along, that we can just broadcast it out there. This is the one that we can simply broadcast out there on an existing pasture and it'll work. some ways that we've seen that are very beneficial with slinging ryegrass is that you can mix it with fertilizer and sling it just as you see in the picture right here with a fertilizer buggy. If we're going to do that, though, we need to be applying about 150 pounds of actual fertilizer to be the carrying device for this ryegrass seed. So that's pretty important. If we're just slinging 100 pounds to the acre of fertilizer, it's not going to carry this ryegrass seed the way that we need it to. So a minimum of 150 pounds of application is what we need. Months of utilization, we talked about that earlier, February to March. And then cost per acre, we're looking at about $22 to $25 to $30 per acre roughly is about what we're looking at. You're looking, depending where you get it from, and I've priced a lot of ryegrass here over the last couple of weeks. You're looking at about $38 up into the neighborhood of about $52 a bag on this stuff. And so it just kind of depends. That's how we justify that price right there. Just depends on who you get it from and what variety that you're getting. Our small grain planting guidelines, here's where I said we'd get to the plant depth on them. Here it is. So this is for our oats, wheat, rye, and triticale. And again, don't confuse rye with ryegrass. This is cereal rye right here that we're talking about. Our seeding rate is significantly higher than what we just talked about. It's 80 to 110 pounds to an acre. Plant depth is 1 inch to 1.5 inches. So you heard me talk all along about if you just sling oats, rye, triticale, or wheat out onto an existing pasture, they won't work. This is the reason. They require a planting depth of 1 inch to 1.5 inches, but that months of utilization we talked about earlier, December to April. Seed cost per acre, roughly somewhere in that $30 to $50 per acre ballpark range. If we're going to mix different species or mix grasses and legumes, here's your slide that you've been looking for. Mixing ryegrass and small grains. We're going to drop that ryegrass down just a hair to 20 to 25 pounds to the acre. And then we add in that 80 to 120 pounds of small grain. Planting depths recommended for each. And so we're probably going to move into using a drill or a no-till drill if we're going to mix the ryegrass and the small grains together. If we're going to mix ryegrass and legumes, we're going to do 15 to 20 pounds of ryegrass. And then I mentioned this earlier, 2/3 of a pure stand rate of the seeding rate of the legumes. So you go back to those planting charts that we talked about on the planting depth, cut them at 2/3 rate or do them at 2/3 rate of what you see there, and then mix that with the ryegrass. You see our different planting depths there. The ryegrass we can do at 0 to 1/2 inch, and then we need to follow the recommended planting rate of the planting depth of the legumes. Got a chat here, not seeing the slides. Is anybody else having problems with that, or can everybody see the slides okay? Okay, I'm going to assume that everybody can see it. So this is the last slide that I have right here, and then we'll move into questions. And this is the one where it breaks it down for us. All right. So average cost with fertilizer to put these in, and I mean it's a kind of a loaded question and a loaded number right there. You know, we're on seed cost. You know, we can be anywhere in the neighborhood from that 20 all the way up to $50 on our seed cost. It just depends on what we're using. Fertilizer cost, we're going to be anywhere in the neighborhood of 50 to $100 to the acre. And so I just kind of went with a average estimation right here of $70. That's not a hard and fast number per acre. You could be in the neighborhood of 100 to 125 bucks to the acre. I figured one for a guy a couple of days ago with fertilizing based off the soil test at $90 to the acre. And so, you know, we could be I mean, anywhere, I'm going to say 70, 75 is going to be about our average, but we could be 25 to 50 bucks higher than that, depending on your situation. This next one, the average cost of Bermuda grass hay, I've got $60 a bale right there. You know, I've seen hay prices vary anywhere from $40 all the way up to $95 a bale. It just depends on what type of hay that you're getting, what you're feeding, what quantity you're buying in. I mean, these are going back to the first statement that I had right when we started. We're dealing with some tough situations right now in terms of agriculture, and you know, we no longer really use the word average, or I haven't this year, just because the average is kind of out the window this year. We're breaking it down in specific individual situations and really trying to help people out that way, rather than looking at the broad spectrum average. Again, our hay costs just vary so much this year because of fertilizer prices and availability. We didn't have any rain. We had a slight rain. Some people did right there at the middle of August. But you think back from roughly 4th of July to middle of July, and then on into last week, some people didn't get any rain from the 4th of July until right there in October, just last week. And so the middle of October. So you're talking 3 months, 90 days without any rain, and our hay supply is extremely short. So back to the topic at hand right now, trying to draw a conclusion to planting winter pastures. What we're trying to do is cut down our time frame of feeding hay 45 to 60 days. So basically what that looks like is we're trying to stop feeding hay by that March 10th date that I had mentioned earlier when we were talking about ryegrass utilization. We're hoping to stop feeding hay on March 10th. When you look at that, if we can get those spring pastures to really move on with what we plant or volunteers that come up, hopefully we're moving into a time where we don't have to rely on any supplemental feeding by May the 1st. You know, we'd like to say April 15th, but this last year was about May the 1st. Because that soil temperature never warmed up to the point we needed it to until about June 15th this year, when typically we like to see it do it on April 15th. So that's how I'm getting these numbers that you're seeing here on the screen. Hay cost, so that's going to figure back into that $60 a bale right there. What I did was looked at about a 900-pound bale of hay. A lot of people are not feeding the 5x6 bales anymore, the big bales of hay anymore. So we're usually looking at about a 900-pound bale of hay. So I divided 60 by that 900 pounds. I believe it was 0.0666 as we went along there. And I times that by 30 pounds per day, which cost us at 30 pounds per day is kind of an average at what we're looking at on most of these cows now. You know, we've got a lot of cows and that's why we don't typically use animal unit much anymore in terms of my conversations with people, because an animal unit is a 1,000-pound cow and her calf at the side. Well, how many 1,000-pound cows do you see anymore? You know, we used to talk about 800-pound heifers, but we've got a lot of 900,000-pound heifers now. Our mature cows, you know, we'd like to think we got 1,250-pound cows, but in some cases we got 1,400-pound cows, and I've seen a lot of 1,600-pound cows as well. And so I'm just averaging that out. It's about 30 pounds per day on what our cows will eat. So we're looking at about $2 a day is what that cow's going to cost us. She heard me say average stocking rate on a winter pasture if our management strategies are in place. If we're planting it the way that's recommended, if we're managing it the way that's recommended, if we get the rainfall and the sunshine that we need, if all of that lines up, about a cow to an acre is what we're going to see on a lot of those cool season grasses. So therefore, you can conclude that the amount of acreage per cow for winter pasture is going to cost you about 85 cents per day. And that's looking at that 60 days divided by $70 per acre to put this in. So I take that back up to looking at that hay cost. $2 per day. If we don't have this winter pasture available to us, then we're going to be feeding hay until about April 15th. I mean, that's just, and many of us, you know, I mean, we ran out of hay last year, but this last year that we had, some people were still feeding hay on May the 1st last year. So when we look at that extension of feeding that hay at $2 a day versus an 85-cent, I mean, you can even move it up to $1.50 if you wanted to per day, depending on the management strategies that you put in. And the conclusion is that putting in winter pastures, even on a year like this, is definitely affordable and definitely something that we need to consider, because that's some real hard and fast numbers for you right there. Another conclusion here, I said that was my last slide. I thought it was, and I'll get to that question here in the chat box just in a minute, but legumes do well, or grass pastures do well. Make sure you're paying attention to that soil type, the soil pH that you have. If you don't know your soil pH, that's where soil test comes into play. You can visit with me about it. Generally speaking, based off where you're located at, we can probably determine a rough estimate of where you'll be at on your soil pH. But in most cases, we need to turn to the soil test on that. Pay close attention to that planting method. Again, soil moisture was something that we talked about. You know, are you going to get some rain after you put it in? Something to look at. With the legumes, consider using the bloat blocks. Manage grazing during the wet spring to avoid decline of summer perennials. This is one that we have to pay attention to. Analyze cost. I want to back up to that bullet point right below or right above analyze cost. If you're going to put in cool season grasses, if you've got 10 cows and you're going to plant by the recommended planting rate, seed depth, planting method, and fertilize the way that you should, if you've got 10 cows, you don't need any more than 10 acres planted to cool season pasture. If you're running those 10 cows on 50 acres and you go out and plant 50 acres worth of cool season grasses, what's going to happen is you don't have enough cows to utilize all of that. And so you're going to, with the amount of spring rain that we saw in May this year, or just generally speaking, the amount of spring rains that we've gotten over the last 5 years, we have to stock those cool season pastures, spring pastures properly, because if not, we've got a ton of excess forage out there that we simply can't manage to allow those warm season pastures to get started and start growing. So only plant what you're going to need is something very important to pay heed to. That's my contact information right there. Will we get a copy of the slide deck? If you will email me directly the slides, I will email them to you on an individual basis. And so if you want a copy of the slides, email me and we'll get those over to you. Let me stop the share at this point in time. And I'm also going to stop the recording.